Welcome to another edition in our series of Southeastern Conference basketball roster previews for the 2021 season. I'm your host, Chris Lee. Blake Lovell, my co host, joins me. Blake, today we arrive at the Arkansas Razorbacks, one of the more interesting programs in the SEC. Eric Musselman has got a way he wants things done. He's got a style of play. He's got a style of how he builds his roster. And once again, he has done this in very Eric Musselman-like fashion as he gets the Razorbacks ready to head into the next season.
Yeah, the Must Bus is rolling not only in wins but in the transfer portal as he's done for many years now. He once again goes that route to kind of revamp the roster after losing the guys they did to the NBA and such. But hey, that's a product of being a really good team, and as we know, they were right there, right, with a chance to get to a Final Four last year. So yeah, I think this team will look a little different than the one last season, just in terms of, we think just how much, Moses Moody and someone like that can really just impact the game the way that he did. But I think overall, this is still a team that's going to be sitting there, with a chance to, again, be in that conversation for one of the top teams in the SEC. Probably, a top 25 team. And I think, as always, it's how do all the pieces come together that he's going to bring in from the transfer situation. But when we talk about giving guys the benefit of the doubt, I don't think there's anyone else in college basketball you're probably going to give the benefit of the doubt to more when it comes to handling transfers than Eric Musselman. Even if they all don't work out, he has so much experience doing this. They do this basically as a science, as a staff, and I just think that that they will find a way to make it work as they usually do.
Well, and if you do not follow SEC basketball year round, which you basically have to do to have a competent working
Yeah.
knowledge of everybody's roster, you're listening to this and you're going, "Hey, wait a minute, Arkansas? Are you kidding me? They lost Moses Moody, Justin Smith, and Jalen Tate, who in my mind, and I think probably most people would say, were their best three players." But the fact that you've seen them in some preseason top tens, even, and certainly I think most of the top 25s, that just tells you how good a job Eric Musselman did in terms of bringing in replacements and hopefully for them the right replacements.
Well, and the one thing a lot of these replacements have in common is that they're older, and that's where that's such a valuable thing. I think, especially nowadays, where you do have so many players that transfer, that sometimes your team can get really young in a hurry just because maybe you're not, maybe you swing and miss on a lot of these grad transfers, or seniors or juniors that are transferring. Sometimes maybe teams just have to build a roster on youth because they can't go out and land every grad transfer out there. But as usual, like, he finds a way to land. I think they got four guys that come in as seniors, and just older guys that, one, I think Chris likes the grad transfer, but they've got older guys, and I think that's always going to be a valuable thing, not just in the SEC but anywhere. And I, you look at this team, and I think that's the common theme is, if you're going to lose some of the superstar type players that they did, all the ones you mentioned, at least you bring in guys that, as we say, transferring up, or whether it's Likes transferring from Miami, or Tony transferring from Pitt. Still, like, it's a different level, it's a different situation, but these are all guys that have played, and I think that's a very valuable thing when you're going up against a lot of other places in the SEC that are bringing in transfers too, and all that. So, I mean, it's the same situation. I've said this, we've talked about this with Alabama, but I think the expectation was, when Arkansas hired Eric Musselman, Alabama hired Nate Oates the same offseason 2 years ago. Now they both enter their third season. Like, it was, once they got where we thought they could get, there's probably no going back. Like, you don't anticipate these being the type of programs under these coaches that are going to just fall off. And I don't think you're going to see that with Arkansas. Like, I think they are always going to have an advantage when it comes to transfers because he's done it so much. And I think now it's like, well, you basically get so close to making the Final Four last year. even with a revamped roster. And maybe this team isn't as good as the one last season, and I don't know that it's going to be. I think that's probably unrealistic, at least on paper, because again, you're comparing it to a team that did have the NBA type talents that we're talking about with that team last year. Not that this one doesn't, but I still, you're gonna feel optimistic that they are gonna figure it out to a level of being a very good team, perhaps an SEC title contender, an NCAA tournament team. But I think it's just where's the difference on that? If you try to compare, I don't know what that comparison is necessarily, but I do say that they're not going anywhere. Like Arkansas's not going anywhere as long as Eric Musselman's there.
Well, college basketball starts with who is your backcourt. And my goodness, if anybody did a better job of bringing in backcourt starters than Eric Musselman, I'd love to know who it is. The two big guns he's got, look, he got 5 transfers, 3 of whom are top shelf guys. We'll get to the third one in a minute. 2 more guys that I have some questions about, but I think are good players. But let's start, and this is where you have to start. Chris Likes, who's their point guard, and Aldis Toney, who is, I guess, a combo guard who came from Pitt. Likes averaged last year in 28.5 minutes, 15.5 points, 4 boards, 5.5 assists. Toney was almost 35 minutes a game, 14.5 points, almost 6 boards, 1.3 steals. That is a lot of production. Toney is a really terrific athlete, but my goodness, you start with that backcourt, and that alone puts the Razorbacks in the top half of the league. Supposing the supporting cast is decent, which, spoiler alert, it is. We'll get to that later. But that is why some people have got Arkansas as a top 10, top 15 team in the country, I think, is the foundation of those 2 transfer guards.
Yeah, it's like you bring those guys in and you just put them around, guys that are coming back that arguably down the stretch were just as important to Arkansas' success as some of the other guys, and J.D. Note and Devontae Davis. Like you're comparing all these guys, and that's the thing too, is it's not as though Arkansas is just completely bringing in a whole new group. Like they've got guys that are going to be able to kind of lead these newcomers in the backcourt, and that's what we talked about. We've already done one on Alabama. We talked about Auburn. I think there's some others we'll talk about as we go along in terms of having backcourt depth. That's been the main theme in the SEC, and you said it. Like, if you're going to win, you need that kind of depth, I think, in the SEC. And I would argue that you put Arkansas in there, too. Like, the SEC this season is going to have some of the deepest backcourts of any in the country. Like, and you could probably put a handful of, perhaps, SEC schools in there if you're talking about the top 15, top 20 backcourts maybe in the country this season. I know some people are going to say, well, you got 2 guys here, 2 guys, but like you feel like there are a couple of these SEC schools, maybe 3 or 4, like I said, that could go 4 or even 5 deep with their backcourt and not miss that much of a beat. And I feel like Arkansas is one of those situations now because you bring in Likes from Miami, you bring in Toney, all these guys, and it's just they will be able to. And I think too, we've seen Muss do a really good job of sort of handling his rotation over the years too, even with the transfers he gets in, even with having a lot of people to have to play. I think he does a really good job sort of managing that from a rotation standpoint. He seems to be someone that certainly grasps how to put guys in the right position in that sort of scenario. So I think the most interesting part is just going to be, if we come up at the end of the season, if we make our predictions, who's going to play, 30 minutes, who's going to play 25 minutes, who's going to play 15, and maybe who gets pushed out to where he doesn't play the amount of minutes that we think he's going to. I think that's an interesting question on this, but man, you're going to be able to put Arkansas's backcourt up against a lot of these other teams, and I think that's, again, that's the biggest starting point if you're wanting to compete in the SEC. Because we know there's so many good guards, there's so much good perimeter play in this league, and it's just Arkansas is going to have plenty of that.
Well, here's another guy we haven't gotten to yet in terms of transfers, and he's kind of a wing guy, 6'6", and excuse us if we botch the pronunciation. We've been trying to find the correct one. But Stanley Umude, I think, is what we think it is, from South Dakota, which is one of the better mid-major programs in the country. They've had a lot of success there. He was an all-league player in the Summit League, and a very good player, averaged almost 22 a game last year, and also grabs a few boards to boot. So that's another guy. And with some of these guys like that were stars in lower leagues, sometimes they come in and the competition is too much. Sometimes they come in and they hold their own and then some. That's one where I think we are asking ourselves that question. How's that going to end? Because we've seen it go both ways. But certainly, in addition to those two Power Five transfers they got that were headliners, they got a guy who was one of the better mid-major players in the country last year too.
Well, and that's the thing is like there were a lot of people after him, and that's I think the thing you always look at is it's one thing to look on paper and say, all right, this guy averaged 22 a game, but it's another to say, all right, he averaged 22 points a game, and if we're at a power conference level, we absolutely need this guy, not just because of his numbers, but because he's proven that he can do this against quality competition. And so if you look back, I think this is a completely different scenario, which is why we wanted to put him sort of in a separate category of talking about everybody else, because this is not, I think, that conversation you have where it's like, okay, this guy just really, he played so many minutes, he took so many shots, his usage rate was so high, he has to, can that be sustainable at the SEC level? And maybe it can't to that extent, but if you go back over the years there, he played against Arkansas, I think, whenever they played. I think it's 2019-20. I think they played there. But this is someone who produced against quality competition. You go back to 2018-19, he had 28 points against Kansas. Like I said, they played Arkansas. He's had a lot of other double-digit games. You go back just to last season. He has I'm looking down the line here. He had 39 points against North Dakota State. He had 34 against South Dakota State. 32 against Omaha. He had 41 against South Dakota State. It's just 23 against Nebraska, 24 against Colorado. Look, if you can score that many points, and by the way, too, this guy can rebound as well. That's something else that I think is really going to help this Arkansas team in particular. He knows how to score. I don't care if you're playing at the 350th ranked school or the number one ranked school. I think sometimes if you can score, you can score. And I think he's one of those. We talk about transferring up. How does that adjustment, what's that look like? I don't have a lot of doubts about him because I think he's proven over the years, even again, having to be that guy that takes all the shots and having to play all the minutes he did there for them at South Dakota. I just don't have a lot of question marks about whether he's going to be able to come in and be a consistent scorer. Now, I don't think he's going to be putting up 41 points a game or anything in the SEC, but I do think that he is going to wind up being a very valuable member of this roster and be one of the guys that really factors into what they want to do this season.
Well, two other transfers, Jackson Robinson from Texas A&M. Frankly, I don't know what to make of him at all. He was a top 70 recruit out of high school. A&M had such a weird season last year. Had a lot of transfers out, had a lot of it paused by COVID. That team wasn't very good. He didn't play much, so we didn't get a first glimpse, but it's not uncommon for a very highly rated kid, and he was a four-star recruit, to kind of stumble in an adjustment period in your first year. So certainly in terms of high school talent, I think he was rated number 61 by Rivals. So he's a guy that is a big wild card for them. Trey Wade at Wichita State, who averaged, I think, 6.7 points, 5.6 boards. So he sounds like he's more of a complementary piece. What do you make of the addition of those two, Blake?
Yeah, the Jackson Robinson one is interesting because, we always say it. It's like a guy's highly rated out of high school. He comes in, doesn't play a ton, but, transfers immediately after. Is that because he wasn't good enough to play at Texas A&M, or is it just a fit, right? And it's playing for Buzz Williams is not an easy thing to do. It's that there's a lot that's expected of you, and not to say that it won't be Eric Musselman, but I think that's where we talk about fit. You could replace Buzz Williams' name and Eric Musselman's name with other coaches around the country, and just say that sometimes maybe it just winds up not being the right fit, and thinking that it's going to be, and then ultimately it's not. I think that's where it's hard to know what to expect from Jackson Robinson, but we know the talent's there. But I think the issue is, right, there's so many guys in front of him that we feel like are going to play a double-digit minutes, that where do those minutes come from? I don't know what that looks like, but that I think is kind of interesting. You mentioned Trey Wade. He's another one, a guy that I think on the wing, it'll be interesting to see, but he's another that has experience. I mean, he's a guy coming in as a grad transfer and being able to, hey, how does that help? Because he is someone that played a couple seasons at Wichita State. I think, I want to say he started pretty much most of the games he played in there, which that's a lot over the past couple of seasons. So that is another, Wichita State's not that's not a low major school. Like, that's a team that was playing in a lot of significant games. So there's a lot to go around here. And I think that, again, how Eric Musselman shuffles all the pieces around is always a fascinating thing, not just this season, but any season, I think, with him. But they add more possibilities to this roster, and it's just, there's a lot of directions they can go in.
Well, the thing about Wade, too, is he started playing college basketball in 2016. Now, he redshirted. He started at UTEP, then he went the JUCO route, then he went to Wichita State, and, of course, State gets a ton of kids from the JUCO route. But they listed him at 6'6", 219. So I think between the experience and just the physical build, and if you play at Wichita State, you've got to be a grinder. So to me, we talk sometimes about having to have those glue guys that you need when you've got a team of a lot of guys who are going to want the ball and demand a high volume of shots. You need guys who can be good teammates. So I'm looking at this one and saying that is probably exactly what they needed.
What I find interesting about him is he was a high school senior in 2015-16. That feels like a century ago.
Yeah, it does.
Like, that feels like 2 decades
Barack
ago.
Obama was president then, right?
That is incredible. Like, 2015, it's crazy, isn't it? Like, 2015-16 feels like it was, really, like it was just many, many years ago at this point. But he's been in college for a while. That's a good thing, because, like you said, he's at least been around and under, like, he played, at UTEP, then he went the JUCO route. But he made it work because he played a lot in a lot of games, started a lot of games at Wichita State. So I would expect him to be someone. Gosh, you look at the kid, right? Like, he is built like a rock. So I don't think he's going to have any problem sort of adjusting to the SEC.
Well, we talked to complimentary players. J.D. Notae was kind of that last year, although he scored a lot of points per minutes played. So it's going to be interesting to me, what role does he take on, because he was a very high volume scorer, not really efficient except from the line in a lot of ways, but he took a lot of shots per minutes on the floor. To be exact, he took 343 shots in 719 minutes. That's a ton. So what does he do, given that they bring in the guys that they brought in, in Likes and Tony, who are used to be scoring guys? That is going to be an interesting chemistry thing of how those three fit. Of course, I say that was kind of the case last year too. It wasn't like Moody was a low volume shooter. Jalen Tate got off a lot of shots, not that many, but he took 272 shots. Justin Smith, although he wasn't a guard, he took 292. I guess it's not new for Arkansas to have this issue, but it does beg the question for a guy who probably per minute on the floor took more shots than anybody on that team last year. How does he fit with two guys who are going to take a lot of shots coming in?
Yeah, J.D. Notae had an interesting season, because if you look back, like, a lot of his double-digit consistent scoring games came early in the season. And then down the stretch, his minutes really were kind of up and down a bit. And I think, but too, like, you also can point to examples like against Baylor, right? He plays 15 minutes, he fouls out, so he gets in foul trouble there, but he still scored 14 points in 15 minutes. And, you go up and down the line, and it's just like, he really was someone that I think at times, you didn't necessarily know what to expect, because, he did have some of those games, right? In some of those places where he's playing 11 minutes against Florida, scoring 2 points, 13 minutes against Missouri, those kind of things. Now, again, you don't know, like, there can be injury situations and stuff that maybe you don't know about to factor into some of those things. And obviously, I can't remember off the top of my head back to 2 games in February if that was the case or not. But it was a little up and down in terms of the scoring, and I think the efficiency with that, I think that was probably the biggest thing that stood out, was just the efficiency on the offensive end. He would obviously love for that to be better, but also, does that get better naturally just by having so many of these guys around him? to maybe make that a little bit easier on him. I don't know, and I think that's where I think he's an interesting situation because I would be surprised if like he winds up being someone that's just pushed out in this scenario with all these guys they have coming in, just because he was someone that played so many minutes on a team that, again, is right there with a chance to go to the Final Four. But I also am thinking, well, the efficiency numbers need to get better, and if they don't, does that lead to more of that kind of up and down with minutes to where, maybe he's not as efficient they need him to be in some of those instances. So I would be surprised, again, if he's not, one of those regulars that's just playing a lot based on the experience he got last year. I feel like he will have to be on the floor for them a lot, just in that process of, here's a guy who's, again, been a valuable piece of a team that made as far as they did. But also, look, the competition's going to be there with these other guys we've mentioned. So I think J.D. Note will be kind of a fascinating element of this roster just based on that.
Well, that's a good transition to a place I want to go, because what we saw last year, and we talked about it often, was Eric Musselman would use different guys in vastly different ways depending on who they were playing. And by ways, I really mean more minutes usage, because Connor Vanover, who was my favorite guy in the league to talk about last year just because he's so fascinating, and by the way, he's back this year too, you would see him some games he'd play 25 minutes, the next game he'd play 2. And it just depended on the matchups. And so you've got a coach who seems to like to collect parts that one night he might really lean on you, and the next night, depending on who you're playing, maybe not so much. Now, it's a different situation because J.D. Note and Connor Vanover, their skill sets are a lot different. And Vanover, as we've talked about, is, I won't say a unicorn, but he's a very unique player. But the point is here, even though Note is more like the kids they brought in, you've got a coach who says, hey, some nights you really fit what we need to do, and other nights you might need to take a back seat to some other guys who can fit what we need to do a little bit better. So Eric Musselman's been pretty good at finding the right parts for the right games, and I have a feeling that's going to be in play this year too.
Yeah, I think he's able to pick his spots pretty well in terms of what kind of lineup he needs, in terms of size or athleticism, or maybe they need to get up and down the floor a little bit quicker, in which they're already a team that plays at a pretty fast rate. But yeah, I think that's where, you look at Vanover and you factor in, okay, what are going to be the best spots, and there will be some matchups better than others, right? I mean, he didn't even, he barely played he didn't play at all in those.
Yeah, his usage diminished down the stretch, but like I remember, and I'd have to look this up, but it seemed like early to maybe mid-February, you'd watch him a lot of nights. Yeah. And there were times where he was the most important guy on the floor, because I know he's not a big shot blocker, but just being, 7'3" with long arms, just standing there and putting your arms up, even if you don't block a shot, that's tough to go around. He could step out and hit the 3 ball. A lot of times he just was, like I said, he was a guy that you may not see another one like him anywhere. But yeah, I mean, I just wonder about him and a couple other guys. You got Devontae Davis that I think we've talked about some, Jalen Williams. Like, those are 2 more returnees who were in their rotation last year. And, do those guys just continue being complementary parts coming off the bench? I suspect with who they're bringing in, probably so. But you really can't have the complete conversation about this team without talking about those 3 guys.
Yeah, I think Davis and Williams I think they'll be a big part of what they do, just because they are like those glue guys I think you talk about, where, they're good enough to really, I mean, like, they're good enough, I think, to propel themselves into all SEC type players. And so I think that's where depth will be a luxury on this team, because you do have guys like that who I think have proven that they can, or they do have the potential to be with that. Now, Williams, look, it was very up and down in terms of how much he played and all that stuff, but like, you can see the talent's there, and as we always say, like, you can't teach 6'10", and you can't teach that type of size that he has. And with Vanover, you look at, just think about 3 games here. I'm pulling up his stats. So like against Mississippi State, Arkansas wins that one handily. 13 points, 8 rebounds, 3 blocks, 2 steals in 29 minutes. Kentucky, 12 points, 4 rebounds, 2 blocks in 17 minutes. And then against Missouri, by the way, they win all these games. 12 points in 12 minutes, and he also has 4 rebounds, 2 blocks, and 2 assists. So he doesn't have to play 25 minutes a game, but it's just picking the spots for him. And I think that's exactly what Eric Musselman probably will be able to do this season, because there may be matchups that he doesn't necessarily fit well into, and maybe it becomes a thing where he gets pushed out. I don't know, but I do think that this is where it kind of goes back to how the conversation started with Musselman has done this so much now to where I just think that he's going to probably figure out how to best utilize all these guys. And inevitably, there will be a couple of these guys that we talked about that do not play anywhere near as much as maybe we thought they would. It's just it's a numbers game. But it's not for a lack of, I think, Muss having a chance to put them in a position to be a big, significant factor in the rotation. It's just they won't be able to do that with everyone. And I think it's going to be kind of interesting to see who maybe are the ones that make that leap and become guys that they can't afford to take off the floor, and who are some of those guys that maybe do not get anywhere near perhaps the minutes we thought they would on this team.
Well, and I'm spitballing here, okay? I mean, and maybe it's as simple as Vanover's an Arkansas kid, and he just was more interested in staying closer to home. Because remember, he started at Cal before he transferred to Arkansas. So maybe that's a large part of it. I'm guessing it probably is. But here's the thing. Musselman's not afraid to run guys off. And Vanover's a kid who was going to have options. I mean, Connor Vanover could slot in and play 25 minutes at most schools, I would think. You're talking about a team last year that was very talented and had a lot of parts. And so this is just implied. But I would think if there wasn't some plan for a marriage where both were comfortable where they would fit, Vanover wouldn't be around because, again, there would not be a shortage of landing spots if he'd wanted out.
Yeah, exactly. And like we said, there's not a lot of 7'3" guys walking around that has his skill set. And I think that's something, too, that's important to remember is this is not someone that's just 7'3" that, has size. Like, he's 7'3", and as we said, I mean, he can do a lot of different things. Is he as athletic as some of the other big guys in the SEC? No, but he still, he just has very unique skill set. And I think that's where, the expectation is he's not going to have to play 35 minutes a game. But in those 20 minutes maybe that he plays, 15, whatever, you can get a lot in that amount, which I just talked about in some of the stats that he had in some of those games playing less than 15 minutes that are major, momentum swings perhaps, and major parts of helping the team win the game when you come back and look at it. So, yeah, I think that is a very good point.
Well, there's two other guys in here that we haven't talked about. You've got KK Robinson, who last year played, one game before he, what did he do, break his foot, I think? Yeah, I mean, he scored, 15 points in his collegiate debut. So, you don't even think about him because of last year. You've got, they brought in Chance Moore, who was a top 50, top 100 recruit, depending on where you looked. And Arkansas has had, it seems to me, some success in turning that next tier of guys that maybe aren't McDonald's All-Americans, but making them into really good players. So, I mean, again, they've got a great head start without those two guys, but those are two kids that have got some talent too.
Yeah. It's like, again, where do you fit everyone in? Like, I think that's the thing is how does it all come together? And I think that's the big question, because they've just brought in so much talent, and they've got talent coming back, and it's an impressive roster. Like I said, it's one that, I mean, look, you've got a top 100 freshman that I don't know where his minutes are at, right? Like a Chance Moore, I don't know what his minutes look like this season, but it's a good thing. It's a good problem to have, I think, if you're Muss, is you've got all these different ones to work with. And like we said, it's going to be a different season because you don't have a guy like Moses Moody on this roster. Do you have a Justin Smith on this roster? Do you have a Jalen Tate on this roster? I don't know, but it's gonna be a different team. But that's not to say that they can't still achieve a very high level of success. But those are three guys in particular that are not going to be easy to replace. But I think with the pieces that they have, they're not going to try to go out and be the 2020-21 Arkansas team. Like, they're going to be the 2021-22 Arkansas team that's probably going to look a little different, maybe even play a little bit different, but the principles are still going to be the same. And I think the same theme is that they're still going to have a lot of depth and talent to work with there in Fayetteville.
I stand corrected. Robinson played 11 games last year. I think he only played 92 minutes. Yeah, that's right. But again, he did have some flashes against some out-of-conference teams. So just to issue a small correction there, I wanted to get that out of the way. Blake, anything else on Arkansas today?
No, I think it's, again, it's a team that's I would just anticipate being right there in the mix. When we talk about some of the best teams in the SEC, it's an NCAA tournament team. I feel pretty good about that. It's just, it's how different does it look from a season ago? And, the expectation is that Arkansas will keep the thing rolling right along here. But, too, it's there are guys you have to replace. And I think you always have to keep that in mind, as you can't necessarily go into this thinking, all right, the Elite Eight is where we're going to be at just because that's where we got to last season. I think there are some questions that probably need to be answered early on about how some of these transfers fit together, the chemistry and all that. If they can answer those, again, this is a team that I think can still win a lot of games and be right there as one of the top teams in the league.
Thank you for listening to the Arkansas edition of our SEC roster previews. Be sure to follow us on YouTube at The 14. Find us on Twitter at Southeastern14. Or excuse me, that's at 14 Southeastern is how the Twitter account is formatted. If you can follow us there or subscribe to either one, that really helps us out. We'd appreciate you doing that as we get off the ground here with all our endeavors. And, of course, we got a website, southeastern14.com. We've got a podcast, too, that you can subscribe to on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get those. But anyway, I'm your host, Chris Lee. He's Blake Lovell. Thank you for listening to this edition of the 14. We'll have more roster previews to come down the line, so be sure and check back later for those.